Hey guys, I'm back with round 5 of my World Open tournament. In this round, going into it, I was on 3 points out of 4, and I was paired against Grandmaster Aram Hakobyan, I believe from Armenia. And strong GM, he's a couple years younger than me, so I think he has a ton of potential. And yeah, this was definitely another tough game. He went with D4. I stuck with my King's Indian, and pretty quickly we got into the classical main line with e4 and bishop e2. Here I decided to play e5. I've also played knight a6 before, as well as knight bd7, but for this game I just wanted to stick with the main line classical stuff. He castled, and I played knight c6. Now after d5, knight e7, we'll get the pretty popular Mar del Plata variation, starting with knight e1, or I can go with the bayonet attack with b4. But instead he played this pretty rare move, bishop e3, which kind of looks like the Gligorich system, but in the Gligorich system, white typically plays bishop e3 in this position before black has played knight c6, with the idea being that if now I play knight c6, white would actually want to just simply close things up with d5, and then after the knight moves away. One advantage of having not castled here for white is that they can still go knight to d2, and actually the king is going to be safer on e1 for the time being, as the rook is often useful for white's defense against black's typical kingside play. But white's queenside play is pretty much all the same. White still wants to go b4, knight b3, rook c1, c5, and just get all of the same ideas on the queenside, whereas it's kind of harder for black to get our kingside ideas in. But after castling and black having played knight c6, bishop e3 now is certainly different, as well, white isn't in time to play d5 yet, and black has this move knight to g4, which I ended up playing. Now I was already, I don't want to say out of book here, because I knew knight g4 was the move, but I definitely hadn't checked this line in a long time, so I was very uncertain of any concrete knowledge here. So okay, knight g4 is I think an extremely natural way to just try to fight back against white's idea, just immediately challenging the bishop. White played bishop g5, which makes sense. I played f6, and now bishop h4. I think bishop c1 here is also a move where white argues that now black's structure has been a little bit weakened here, a little bit awkward with f6, and the bishop just goes all the way back to c1. I think here black can just play f5 anyway, and it's a pretty reasonable King's Indian. Bishop h4 is definitely, I think, maybe more challenging, and the point is that white keeps this pin against the queen alive, and so this is kind of making it harder for black to push f5 here. I have to first get my queen out of the way with queen e8 or queen d7, but both of these moves can be awkward for black to play. Instead, after some thought, I decided to just play knight h6 here. Which I think is a reasonable idea in this type of position. Whenever black has done this early knight g4, bishop g5, f6 stuff, the knight usually comes back via h6 and f7, and then opens up black's pawns to start pushing forward. So I figured this was a pretty reliable plan, and I should stick to it. Also reasonable is g5 here, and then after bishop g3, knight h6, black has ideas of pushing a quick f5, and if ef, wanting to take with the knight. I think this is also very reasonable for black. Okay, so I played knight h6. My opponent played d takes e5, which I was kind of expecting, because at this point, if white closes the center with d5, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, as this bishop on h4 is eventually just going to be a big target, and it would much rather just be on e3 in this type of position. So yeah, d takes e5. White is mainly wanting to keep the center open and play for this kind of initiative. I played de, and now queen b3. And actually the unpleasant thing here was that my opponent was actually playing extremely quickly, almost instantly, all of his moves up to queen b3, indicating that of course he had prepared the line, or maybe not for this game but previously, and he was very familiar with what he was doing. I of course have been out of book for a couple moves, so this was this was certainly unsettling, because you don't want to just be burning 20, 30, 40 minutes of clock time while your opponent is still hanging out in a position that they've just checked with the computer. But Nevertheless, what can you do? You don't want to just play fast and bad. If you don't know the position, you have to sit there and think and just try to figure out, what are the opponent's main threats, what are their main ideas, what are my main ideas, and just doing the best you can, really, given the situation. So I spent a lot of time here trying to figure out what's going on. I mean, at first glance, it does look quite scary. White's queen on b3 is putting pressure on b7, has a potential check with c4, c5, and white is also ready to put a rook on the d file and gain this tempo against my queen. And I think the real dynamic problem that black is having is that after rook d1, queen moves somewhere, either e7 or e8, let's say, knight d5 is going to be white's next move, and that might be hard to deal with because this is hitting the c7 pawn. And if I eventually put my queen somewhere on f7, then that will kind of run into c5 again, and then maybe bishop c4. And yeah, it just looked very, very risky right away. I did strongly consider just playing a move like g5. I think this is a common resource for black in this type of position, just to get the kingside counterplay going. I really wasn't sure how to evaluate something like this because whenever we play both g5 and f5 together, it makes things kind of better for white in terms of taking on f5 here, because black can no longer take with the pawn and keep the e4 square covered. So I'm always concerned about positions like this where white has this really nice e4 square, nice grip on the light squares, and it's not clear that black is going to be able to generate any kind of real attack in the position, whereas white just might be just comfortably and positionally better. I mean, here maybe knight d4 is something that black can try, but in general, I really just wasn't sure about that type of position. So eventually I decided on the move knight to d4, which to me looked like a fairly logical move. It is a tempo move, it's an active move, and it's also kind of forcing this exchange, knight takes d4, e takes d4, which gives black a potentially strong pawn on d4 that can one day be supported by the dark square bishop as soon as I get my other pawns going. So this appealed to me, and I thought for a little while here I didn't see any concrete issues with it. Of course, I was worried, going into such a sharp position against someone who is clearly prepared with the computer. But, well, yeah, what can you do? You have to just kind of trust your analysis and follow your instincts and do the best you can. So we ended up getting this position, and I think around here, actually, my opponent started to think a little bit. Which is always a sign of both good news and bad news. The good news is now your opponent isn't armed with, let's say, computer preparation and is going to start playing at below 3200 level. But the bad news is that the move you just played, since it wasn't considered in his prep, might not be a good move. Maybe the reason he hasn't seen your move before is because it's a blunder, and now he's going to figure out why, and you're going to lose the game. So it's always very unnerving when the opponent starts thinking. You don't know if it's because you've made a good move or you've made a particularly bad move. Well, it's a common situation. I think, again, the best thing to do is actually try to think about this stuff less and just focus on the position at hand and try to make sure that all of your moves are natural and following some kind of logical progression. Okay, well now after e takes d4, it's not so easy what white should do. I think the most natural move is rook a d1 here, and this is kind of the main move I was expecting. Here I wasn't sure whether I would play c5 or go for g5, bishop g3, and then f5, something like this. I thought this kind of position would be somewhat unclear, but at least it's clear what black is playing for. We have like a really strong dark square bishop now, strong pawn on d4, and if white takes on f5, knight takes f5, this knight can always take on g3 and pick up the dark square bishop. And some position like this, I thought black feels structurally kind of worse. The g5 pawn is particularly weak, but at least getting the dark square bishop would be some form of compensation for that. It turns out c5 here, which I was also really considering, is probably not that good, as after knight d5, this knight kind of establishes itself here, and black is really missing the chance to put the pawn on c6 here, and just dislodging the knight from this good square. So hopefully I would have decided against that. It turns out the best move is actually the move queen e8, which I actually had a chance to play in the game as well, but I did not seize it. And the point of this move is to simply get out of the pin, target the e4 pawn. So now if white moves the knight, black is just going to be taking on e4. And it's also setting a nice trap here. If white plays rook takes d4, this is actually a pretty serious blunder. After g5 and f5, again our kind of favorite theme, turns out black has an attack on the rook and is threatening f4, trapping the bishop, and white is actually just losing some material here. So this queen e8 is a really strong move. I didn't really see the idea over the board. I wish I had. Because in the game, actually, instead of playing the immediate rook a1, white first threw in c5 check, which I think is pretty logical, stopping me from being able to play c5. I played king h8, and now rook a1 was played. And here again, actually, black had this resource, queen e8, and here I think black is getting a very reasonable position. Again, if knight d5, we take on e4, then after knight c7, rook b8, I forget what the computer evaluation here is, but it looks very messy and for white because, okay, both bishops are hanging. White has to immediately figure out what to do about that. The knight on c7 is potentially stranded as well, so this is, I don't think this is such a great position for white here. And, okay, again, rook takes d4 is simply not possible because g5 and f5, and now black again has just this nasty double threat of taking the rook and pushing f4, so this is just not working for white. So yeah, in the game I ended up playing g5 here, bishop g3 f5, just kind of going back to my previous idea. The interesting thing is actually that what I did was totally computer approved, so I kind of felt pretty good about that after the game. Like in this position, it turns out that black is worse in pretty much all lines except for the one chosen in the game, knight d4. I think maybe g5 is also okay, but knight d4 is actually the clean equalizer here. But the main point that one has to see to kind of justify this is, like I mentioned again, after rook a1, queen e8 is just the cleanest move here for black. Everything else leads to a pretty unclear position. Okay, so I end up going g5 and f5. White takes on f5, knight takes f5, and he plays the move knight b5, which I think was probably posing the most problems to black here. So yeah, now I think I definitely started to misplay things. At this point, white is threatening the c7 pawn, and he's potentially threatening to take on d4. The main line I was considering here is knight takes g3, and pretty much in every line I mostly focused on h takes g3, and I was wondering what to do about this position. I didn't really want to play c6 here because of knight d6, so I was thinking about a6. Which to my eyes allowed knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and queen c4, something like this. And yeah, I wasn't sure how to evaluate this position. I felt like, okay, if I allow white to just take back on d4, then white's just going to be a pawn up. I could take on f2 here, where after rook takes f2, I have bishop takes f2 check, king takes f2, and I have a tempo here to kind of get my queen out from the attack and try to develop my pieces. But from afar this looked extremely dangerous to me, and I just felt like I'm really going to be behind in development. Maybe concretely black might be, you know, somewhat okay here with like queen f6 check and then getting the bishop out, but it looked really dangerous, and my king looked somewhat exposed here. Instead of a6, black could just play the move queen e7. This I think was also a move I was considering here. And it comes up in a lot of lines because it opens up this double attack against the bishop and the pawn. And I think objectively things are going to peter out to equality here. Maybe white will be able to take the d4 pawn, I'll take the c5 pawn, and things will just get traded off. But objectively, I think black is doing totally fine here. The bishop on g7 is just a really strong piece. So yeah, after knight takes g3, okay, white could also play queen takes g3. And this might be a better choice objectively, hitting the pawn on c7, and then after something like bishop f5, I think black simply has enough activity here. Now knight c7 is not as good because of rook c8, and I think the engine gives some line that leads to something approximately equal here, after like bishop c4. But yeah, basically I think the position is still pretty complicated, but overall, black should be pretty much okay. In the game, I ended up making a pretty serious mistake here based on just kind of a bad hallucination. I played the move a6, which to me looked good at the time, but now is definitely just can be seen as a blunder. And my opponent took on c7, and here after I played knight takes g3, I simply forgot that white can recapture with the queen here and defend the knight on c7. So I basically thought this move was impossible because after h takes g3, I can just take the knight here for free. And if white takes the rook, then I can take on e2 with check, king moves, and this should be good for black for any number of reasons. I mean, I simply have two minor pieces for the rook. The knight on f4 is going to be really active. Light squared bishop is going to be super strong, and I mean, this is just a great position for black. So I definitely didn't think my opponent would go for this. I think the main way to kind of explain the mistake is that after a6, I was mainly considering that white would play bishop takes c7 here, because I thought this was kind of the critical move. And my idea here was to play queen e7. And I think this one I calculated pretty accurately, which is funny, because it's a lot more complicated. But here I'm keeping an eye on the bishop on e2, hitting the bishop on c7. The knight is still under attack, and I think white just has a lot of hanging pieces. The line I calculated was something like bishop d6. I take on d6, knight takes d6, queen takes e7, and now I'm just up a piece. If knight f7 check, then I can just take this one. Then after queen takes e7, I think black has a couple moves, but probably bishop e6 or queen e6 is the easiest, and just immediately developing and kicking white's queen out. Then black just has two bishops for the rook and is doing well. And if rook de1 instead, trying to just play for the initiative, then after queen h5, white just doesn't have enough because the queen is covering all of the important squares, and objectively black has a big advantage here. So this one, I calculated just fine, and I think it's because this line was so complicated that I just forgot to double check knight takes c7. I had already kind of dismissed it due to knight takes g3, and as soon as I played a6 and knight takes c7 showed up on the board, I just realized, oh man, what I had done. Yeah, now things are just bad for black, and I just kind of gave up this pawn very unnecessarily. So I ended up taking on g3. I mean, there's nothing better. Queen takes g3, and unfortunately black just has no resources here. The rook is under attack. It would be nice if I could just simply play rook b8 here, as white's knight is actually kind of stranded. So if white didn't have a good way of getting the knight out, then my next move would be rook f4, and the knight would actually have a lot of trouble, and black might just be winning. But the problem is the rook is also hanging on b8, so white has a number of moves with the knight that can, let's say, get the knight out and keep an eye on the rook. Knight e6, of course, doesn't work because the bishop takes e6. My opponent chose knight takes a6, which I think was definitely a good move. Now if I take on a6, queen takes b8, there's really just not enough compensation for the exchange. Black just can't create any serious threats here whatsoever. So instead I played rook a8, but now I'm giving up two pawns. Of course I'm going to be winning back one on a2. So I still figured it was certainly complicated and not an easy conversion for white, because it's just one extra pawn, and a lot of times that can end up being not enough. So white played knight c7 back. I took on a2, and white played queen b3, so hitting the rook, defending the b pawn. I decided to play rook a5. Queen b6 was played. This was a nice move, hitting the rook again and defending the knight, also allowing the knight to move away freely and maybe offering a queen trade soon. I played rook a4. And here it turns out that actually things are not that easy for white. I mean, knight b5, yeah, is not such a great option because after the queen trade, white's extra pawn gets doubled. Black can play rook b4, and immediately it just feels like black has some counterplay and some compensation. Bishop is coming out soon, second rook, and so on. It turns out bishop d3 was the strongest move here, which I think makes sense. Is just putting the bishop on a really good square and trying to eventually put some pressure on this diagonal if the queen can never find its way to the e4 square or anywhere on this diagonal will be pretty difficult for black to defend against that. So that was a nice idea. Instead, my opponent actually repeated here with queen b3. I played rook a5, and he decided to play knight b5. So he wanted to get his knight out but not trade queens on b6. But this actually, lets black into the game a little bit, which means that it really wasn't easy for white to convert the previous position. So I played queen e7. I think this was the right move, hitting the bishop and the pawn again on c5. White played queen c4, kind of the only move to defend against both threats. And here I decided to play bishop d7, with the idea of hitting the knight, kind of inducing knight to d6 here. Because knight takes d4, I felt like it actually simplifies things a little bit, but it's kind of in black's favor to trade off these pawns, because now my bishop has opened up and white's b pawn will be a big target, and I'm only down one pawn, so if I can win a pawn back, then of course black will be much closer to equalizing. So yeah, this I felt like would be pretty tricky to convert, especially there's some potential for positions with opposite color bishops where this knight might get traded off for my light squared bishop. So instead, I think my opponent played it much better. He goes knight d6, just keeping a strong knight on the board, not trading these pawns. And my idea was to play b6. But after b4, it simply just doesn't work out for black. White just has too much solidity in the position. What I should have done going back here was actually play the move bishop e6, which is very natural, just developing the bishop with tempo. White goes something like queen d3. And then I think the computer gave bishop d7 in this position. So here the big point is that white's queen is no longer on c4. So that means whenever the knight moves somewhere, I can just immediately take on c5. So knight d6 doesn't really make a whole lot of sense after rook takes c5 and the knight is being under attack. So white would probably have to play knight takes d4, and then after rook takes c5, we get kind of that position I was talking about where, okay, white is undoubtedly better, extra pawn, but it's definitely not an easy extra pawn type of position to convert. White really will have to work a lot to win this one. So I feel like black could have really put up much better defenses in that type of position. Okay, well I played bishop d7, knight d6, b6, b4. Now I played rook a4, and again bishop d3 is what the engine likes here, just putting the bishop on this diagonal, maybe trying to play bishop c2 and queen d3 soon. And yeah, after when my opponent does bishop h5, I think white is also just very close to winning here as well. This is a really sharp move because it's simply threatening knight f7 check, as well as like moving some rook to e1, and now it just feels like white is getting a nice initiative against my king, especially with my rook kind of stuck on a4. It's yeah, not a great situation for black to be in here. After some thought, I decided to play b takes c5 and just start grabbing pawns. I don't really think black had much better options at this point. I think white's initiative is just kind of too strong. But my opponent's technique here I think was quite good. So he goes knight f7 check. I took on f7. And the main thing I was kind of hoping for was, let's say, a position like queen takes f7, where we can trade queens and I can take the pawn on b4. And here for the exchange, I would have a pawn and I would have these two connected passers, which are, I think, always difficult to play against. Objectively, I'm not sure if black fully has enough compensation here or not, but I mean, in some cases, black can even be better in this type of situation, especially once the two pawns start rolling and they're being supported by the two bishops. So this was kind of like the dream, something I was like very much hoping for. But of course, white has ways of avoiding it. Number one, he doesn't have to take on f7 here. He could have just taken with the bishop, where after something like rook takes b4, queen d5, I don't think black has any kind of full compensation here, mainly because white still has a lot of pieces and can generate a really strong attack, like rook e1 is coming, even rook b1, trading off the rooks and then eventually getting a rook down to b8 or b7. And yeah, I think objectively white is probably just very close to winning here, if not just outright winning. I think, yeah, just not enough compensation for the exchange here. The extra rook is too strong in such an open position. So that was already good enough. My opponent chose a different way. He decided to first throw in rook fe1 before recapturing the rook on f7. During the game, I thought this was a pretty good move because it kind of forces black to figure out where to put the queen before white takes back on f7, also gains a tempo. I decided to play queen f6 here. I think this is maybe the best try. Queen f8 was also possible, but after bishop takes f7, rook takes b4, and queen d5 again, it just looked like a really difficult position for black. I think my king is going to be under heavy fire, and yeah, I think it's just a matter of time before white's rooks kind of win the position. Like bishop a4, rook b1, for example, and again, I'm going to have really serious issues on the back rank here. Okay, so I decided to play queen f6, bishop takes f7, and I play this move, bishop f8. So the idea here is, well, rook takes b4 I think is pretty bad in case of queen takes c5, and I'm losing one of my prize pawns, and rook on b4 is hanging, so it looks like white is just winning here. But after bishop f8, well, I'm still threatening to take on b4, and I'm holding on to the c5 pawn, so I thought this was quite logical. And here I think my opponent spent a lot of time, but he ends up finding what I believe is actually the only way to clear advantage for white, or I should say decisive advantage. So I thought it was definitely good technique on his end. He starts with the move queen d5. I played bishop c6, and then he goes queen e5. So this was really the star move, because he finds a way to trade queens under the best possible circumstances. In the game, I was mostly thinking about queen e6, which I think looks like a much more natural move. But here the problem after queen takes e6 is that if white goes rook takes e6, which looks very active, this runs into bishop d5, and rook f6 is actually bad in view of king to g7, and white is actually just losing a piece. Instead, if white goes rook e8, then black can take on f7, rook takes f8, king g7, I get this important tempo, and then after a move like rook c8, any other moves would just be met with rook takes b4. Here it looks like white is attacking both of black's pawns and is about to win one, but black has some options here. For example, black can play c4, and the d4 pawn is not able to be taken by white because of rook a1 check. And okay, I think white is still doing very well here concretely, but during the game this looked extremely unclear. I think better for black is actually a better try is to play bishop b3 first, and then prepare to push c4 next once the bishop is more active. So yeah, I was definitely kind of hoping for this, and this line looked very unclear. Better for white would be back in this position to take on e6 with the bishop, and then after rook takes b4, rook b1, takes, and king g7. I think this is far from an easy conversion. I mean, again, it's undoubtable that white is better. The bishop can blockade the pawns for now, but with only pawns on one side of the board against two bishops, definitely a difficult conversion. Maybe objectively a draw, but yeah, not easy for white to convert this one at all. So yeah, with queen e6 looking good, I was feeling at least a little bit optimistic, but after queen e5 showed up on the board, now I realized that actually things are not so rosy as they seem. My main problem is if I go king g7 here, for example, white can trade queens, and then this important move bishop e8, and forcing a trade of bishops, also activating white's rook. And here black is just not in time to get the pawns going. I think white probably has a number of good moves here. Maybe rook b8 is the best move, with the idea being that after rook takes b4, white can trade rooks and take on d4, and black just has very far from enough here, and white should be winning. So with this being a pretty serious problem, I decided to play queen takes e5, but then after rook takes e5, now white's rook is super active. He's hitting the g5 pawn, maybe hitting the c5 pawn. I played king g7, and well, here if bishop e8, now I wouldn't really be giving white this extra tempo, so I could take on e8 and then go rook takes b4. And this again would be, I think, pretty unclear because, well, I have one pawn for the exchange. I still have my strong connected passers, and white doesn't have any kind of immediate counterplay. But instead of bishop e8, he has a much more accurate move bishop d5, hitting the bishop and also threatening to take on g5 with check. And in this whole time, white hasn't really been able to take on c5 yet, but if I just move my bishop away quietly, then here white could take on c5 and finally get rid of my connected passers, and all my compensation would be completely gone. So after bishop d5, I'm kind of obliged to trade on d5 in order to keep my connected pass pawns. But now white snags the g5 check, the g5 pawn, king f6, rook takes d5. And after rook takes b4, I finally got my 2 pawns, but white picked up another pawn in the process, and now white has some pass pawns of his own. And I think the position is objectively just lost for black. My pawns are pretty much stuck here. It's really hard to move them, whereas white has an easy time of making progress and can just push g4, f4, and so on. So it was white to move here. He decided to play the move rook e1, which I think was pretty smart. Keeping my king cut off and not letting my king harass his rook and try to get the pawns moving. I mean, I think it's still a double-edged endgame. There are definitely ways that white can go wrong here, but my opponent basically avoided, I think, all the pitfalls and converted really smoothly. As my pawns are still totally stuck, I can't move them without losing one, so it's very hard for black to do anything here. I played rook b6, g4, rook c6, king f1, bishop g7. I think this is actually a final mistake, but the position is already just losing for black. White has too much play with f4 coming, and then rook e8, and his 2 rooks are going to be really strong. His king can also help defend against my pawns if he needs. But this move, bishop g7, I think it makes things a little bit too easy for white, because after rook c1, all of a sudden I'm not able to keep my pawns defended. The c pawn is hanging, and if I go back bishop f8, well, now white has rook takes d4, and the rook on c6 is hanging, and so this is just totally lost for black. So yeah, basically I'm just losing one of the pawns here. I tried c4, rook takes d4, c3. I figured, okay, might as well push my pawn as far as I can on a dark square now, at least it'll be supported by the bishop. And yeah, this actually wasn't that easy for white to convert, but the result was never really in doubt here, because, well, my pawn is secure on c3 for now, but it's impossible to push. As soon as I go c2, white will just bring the rook back and then take the pawn next move. He can also blockade the pawn if he wants, and it'll be impossible for me to push it. So yeah, I have this kind of blockade going, but with white having, you know, a couple pass pawns on the king side, it's really just not going to be enough. But okay, I tried on for a little bit. I played h5 here, hoping to exchange some pawns. h3, takes, king h4. My only idea here was to just try to be annoying and very pesky with the king. I was also entertaining some fantasies of maybe getting my king stalemated with a rook coming to the 5th rank. You know, you got to keep these ideas in the back of your mind. You never know when they might happen. But okay, white just calmly plays rook c2 here, rook d6, f3. Now if I go rook d2 check, he's simply gonna retreat with rook e2, and black isn't getting anywhere. Instead I played rook d1, and white found a nice move, rook a4. Now at first glance it looks like black is actually just winning with rook d2 check. All of a sudden takes, and white has no way of stopping the pawn thanks to the bishop. But he does have this key idea, rook a5, which simply ends the game, because white is going to be mating on h5 next move. That's always the drawbacks of playing for stalemate, is that you also make it easier for your opponent to mate you. Now it's really close to a stalemate after bishop b5, rook takes e5, but the problem is, of course, that I can still promote, and yeah, just getting mated next move. So this, of course, is not working for black. Instead, I had to play king g5, because now white is just threatening rook a5 anyway and mating me, so I gotta get my king out. But with white being able to push my king back, now black just has really nothing to play for, and yeah, the game is almost over. So rook c5, rook d3, now he brings the other rook over to the a file to bring it in for the attack. I play rook d6, rook a3, strong move with you know, 2 connected passers of his own on the king side. At any point, white can just take on c3, and he'll have a very trivially won rook endgame. I try check, king g3, c2. And now white has a number of ways to win. Rook a6 is definitely the easiest. Bishop f6. And he could play, I think, either rook to c6 here. I was mainly expecting rook a c6 and just picking up the pawn. And yeah, black just has no ideas. White is winning. He chose to move g5, which is also just ending the game on the spot. My pawn isn't going anywhere, and he's just taking the bishop with check next move. And yeah, what can he do? The game is just totally over. So it was a good time to resign here. So yeah, another tough game in the King's Indian. You know, I really was caught by surprise in the opening, but I did manage to kind of get out alive with a pretty reasonable position. Yeah, I made a very unnecessary blunder in my calculation, and just ended up down a pawn for not a whole lot of compensation. Maybe I had better chances to defend later on in the game, but yeah, I was really just playing on my back foot there for a little while, just right out of the opening. So yeah, another tough game, but okay, the tournament continues. At this point, I was on 3 out of 5 and hoping to strike back to keep having a good performance. Alright guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next videos. Take care.